USA, and the language is English. Today is May 11th, 1998. My name is Yana Katzap, and I will be interviewing Michael Novice.
How long are we actually going to do?
Can you please tell us your name?
We're on? All right. My name is now Michael Novice.
Can you spell it, please?
Novice is spelled N-O-V-I-C-E. Michael, the usual way, M-I-C-H-A-E-L.
Was it always Novice?
No, it was not always Novice. I was born by the last name of Sos Novice.
Can you spell that, please?
S-O-S-N-O-W-I-C-Z. Some people who left Warsaw and went to Canada before the war in the 30s, they already spelled it S-O-S-N-O-V-I-C-H, which is sort of more anglicized, but it's got a proper, correct spelling, correct pronunciation.
Do you have any other name?
No. My Hebrew name is Meir. And when I'm called up to the Torah, it's Meir ben Abraham Tzvi. Abraham Tzvi being the name, Hebrew name of my father. And my father's name, the way he was referred to at home, of course I would never call the father by name, but other people called him Herschel. Hirsch or Herschel. And similarly, my mother's name was Basha. The Hebrew name would be Batya. And Basha happens also to be somehow a Polish name. We've come across some ladies from Poland, non-Jewish, and they had the name Basha. Surprising.
When were you born?
June 15, 1927.
And where were you born?
In Warsaw.
Which country?
Poland, Warsaw, Poland.
How old are you today?
Next month I'll be 71.
In Warsaw, can you tell me about your childhood, growing up as a little boy, starting with your family?
Well, as a little boy, it was a happy life. We lived right in the center or heart of the Jewish district. The name of the street was Zamenhof. And everything around me was sort of Jewish, and a small child would think that the whole world is just like that. It would perhaps be comparable to a child being born in Brooklyn or something like that, where everything around, the storekeepers, the institutions, the names of everybody was Jewish. And we felt very comfortable there. And we went to school, to a Jewish school. Quite a lot of Jewish families which I knew and I read about. The child went to a normal school which was supported by the government, and when that school finished, say like 2 o'clock, they went to another school called the Cheder, where they learned the Hebrew subjects.
Was that
but
the same?
In my particular case, I went to a school which, just one single school, but one had to pay for it. So it was like a school we meet now, where it is a religious school, where both secular and Hebrew subjects were taught in the same place.
Was it only Jewish?
Pardon?
Was it only Jewish, the school?
Only Jewish? No, we studied the secular subject, and in addition, Jewish subjects. But they're all in one and the same place. We did not have to move around to change.
Can you tell me a bit about your family? Do you remember your grandparents?
No, I think that by the time I reached perhaps the age of 5 or 6, when I remember things, my grandparents must have been deceased, dead, and so I did not know anything about them.
Do you know their names?
No.
You mentioned your parents. Do you remember what your father looked like?
Yeah, I would, yeah.
Can you describe what he looked like?
With a little beard, and already getting a little bit bald at the top. Cannot remember whether he wore glasses all the time or only occasionally. And he was sort of medium height, medium weight, and he was a happy man, you know. And he liked, the best music to him was music as he remembered from the cantor, the chazan, who performed in the synagogues. And this was the kind of music he and his co-workers used to sing while they were working.
What did your father do for a living?
He made hats which were suitable for children and for ladies. The kind of hats you see people wear on the beach.
Was this his own business?
That was his own business, and he sold it. That was like wholesale, and he sold it to stores, to shops, and they in turn sold it to the public.
How many people work? You mentioned co-workers. How many people worked with him?
It's about 3 or 4.
Were they all Jewish?
Roughly, yes. Friends or relatives, that's the way it was.
And your mother, can you describe your mother, what she looked like?
Maybe a little bit hard to describe, but I'm told that I looked like my mother. And my mother was the business lady, the person who went out and dealt with the customers, and but my father stayed in the background and produced the stuff. My mother was the, well, as I said, the sales lady and contact with customers. And in addition to that, she had to run the household. So she was pretty busy.
Did you have any help?
Yeah, we had help, paid help, and also help in the form of a young lady, perhaps in the 18 or so years old, who found it that her parents could not support her, and so she lived with us. And in return for the upkeep, she helped my mother.
And what was her name?
The first name, which I believe I can still remember, was Bronia.
Was she Jewish?
Yeah, she was Jewish. Yeah.
And the staff that you have, was it a maid, or was it more than one maid?
You know, to help with the household? No, we did not have any additional to that.
You mentioned that there was another help besides that girl, Bronya.
Can't tell exactly how it worked.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I had 2 brothers and 1 sister, so all told there were 4 children.
Can you tell me their names in chronological order?
Well, the oldest was called Charles, or Charles in English, Charles in French.
And when was he born?
He was born, I believe, in 1913, and sometime in 1930, in the 1930s, he quite a few years before the war broke out, he moved to Paris for the purpose of studying. So he was the oldest. Next was another brother, David. He was born either in 1919 or 1920. So when the war broke out, he was 19 years old. And then I had a sister, Hella. She was 2 years older than I. So she was born in 1925. And the last one was me. I was the youngest, born 1927. I was 12 when the war broke out. I was 14 when I left Warsaw.
What was it like growing up with your brothers and sisters?
What was it like? I think it was a happy life because of the age difference and also sort of like occupation. I was more connected with my sister because of the 2-year difference than I was with my brother. My brother, when I was sort of still like bar mitzvah age, he was already close to 19, 20. He was helping more my father, and so I was more with my sister and my mother. An example of that is that when, say, we went on vacation, summertime, it was my mother and my sister and I who went, and my brother stayed behind helping my father in the business.
Where would you go on vacations?
Various places. Usually the place where it was like a spa, because my mother suffered from arthritis. And these places claim that they've got a cure for arthritis by way of having special bath and drinking some sulfur-type water. And so that's the way places went. One place I remember by the name of Krynica something, and that was by the southern part of Poland, by the mountains bordering Czechoslovakia. One other place is called Czechocinek. I don't exactly know where it was. I think it was more like the western part of Poland. And the last one was called Truzgeniki, and that was not far from a town called Vilna, or Vilnius. So it was more towards Lithuania.
Did you go often on vacations?
Only once a year.
How was your family doing financially?
Well, perhaps a little bit above average.
In terms of your religious background, what did your family consider itself?
Religious? Well, we were religious, but perhaps not all religious, in the sense that, for instance, my mother did not wear a sheitel, which religious people do. And my father went to shul, or synagogue, every Shabbos. And of course, always a nice thing to look forward to was the Friday night meal and welcoming the Sabbath.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, first of all, the place had to be cleaned up. Usually white tablecloth, and my mother was busy cooking already, perhaps even a day before. And there was always a nice smell, aroma of the food. And we had our favorite food and drinks.
What were some of your favorite dishes?
It is surprising enough what it is still today, and that is the soup, chicken soup, followed by some meat. I don't think it was always necessarily the chicken, because meat was quite plentiful, and potatoes and some vegetables.
Did you used to wear special clothing for Sabbath?
can't remember exactly, but I would say that one changed into one's better clothes, right?
Did you used to sing at the table?
I think we did sing. Yeah, it's mirrored. Yeah, yeah, we did sing that.
Who would sing?
I think everyone included, yeah. And also we had guests, people who lived in or worked with our, in our place. Another thing which I perhaps should say is that they our place was used as a hospitality place. And so I think we always had visitors in our place who not only came to stay with us for a little while, but also joined us in the meals. And excuse me. I think the reason why our place was always busy with hospitality is that we, in a place like Poland, Warsaw, whenever a family wanted to see a doctor, a specialist, they had to come to Warsaw, and they stayed with us. And similarly, when people emigrated, say to America, Canada, and they had to get the visas and papers, they also stayed with us. So it was, as I said, a busy place as far as hospitality is concerned.
Who started this hospitality?
It's hard to say. As I mentioned earlier, that my parents were not born in Warsaw, but they came from the province. So anybody from that province who had to do business in Warsaw, as I mentioned, either to see a doctor or try to get to America or Canada with a visa, they had to spend a few days in Warsaw in order to attend to their affairs. So rather than staying in hotels, I don't know whether there was such a thing as hotel, not in our sort of Jewish circles, they came to the people they knew, and my parents were top of the list.
Can you tell me about holidays at home? What was your favorite holiday?
Well, Passover, Pesach was a big one.
Why?
Why? Because of the great amount of work that had to be put into preparation. And the place was not, we lived not in a house, but in an apartment.
How big was the apartment?
Perhaps about 4 rooms, 4 or 5 rooms. Not plus kitchen and bathroom, something like that. So the changeover had to be done quickly. And Not like, for instance, in a house like that here, we can be ready for Pesach like a week before, actually, but at home it had to be done sort of like the last few hours.
Why?
Because there was not enough room to have both the stuff for the Pesach and the stuff for ordinary use. So the transition from non-Pesach to Pesach stuff had to be done pretty quickly.
And how did
it was
you...
the last night, you know, the night, not the Pesach night, that was the time when we children slept, but I know that my parents worked right through.
Can you tell me about the Seder itself?
Well, the Seder was nice, and I was the youngest, so I usually had to ask the Manishana questions. We had visitors, and everybody participated, and it was something to look forward to.
What did you have on the table? Some of the food you had for Passover?
Definitely the traditional matzah, and it was not the machine-made
Who made it?
square matzah. I remember, in fact, now that you mentioned, I remember that when a few days before Pesach, when it was time to go and buy the matzah, I went with my mother, and I think with my sister too, just to help her. And we went to the bakery where it was made, and we just sort of waited some while, and we just sort of like picked it off the line. They were round, and they were put not in boxes, but in sort of like a paper type, round paper bags, and stuck one on the other. And I don't know how many boxes, how many pounds or how many boxes my mother bought, but it was sufficient. And also, I remember seeing how they were made, everything by hand, you know, and they put in the oven. And it was done in a bakery where in periods which was not Pesach, they were baking bread there. Another thing which I remember is that when we had to carry the matzahs to our home, maybe perhaps like a 10 or 15-minute walk, we did not carry the boxes ourselves. We did not have a car, so there was no question of sort of coming, the car and carrying. But there were always people standing outside the bakery who were, you can call them porters, and they made a living by carrying the stuff. And it was sort of pretty unionized. So, and people recognized the fact that they relied on carrying these things. They were paid a little bit of money, but not, I wouldn't say very excessive. And that's the way the matzahs were transported from the baker to the house. Another thing which I remember about Pesach period time is that there were vendors on the street selling new utensils, new plates or pots and what have you, as well as food. And also something peculiar to the Pesach period was that people who wanted to make a living out of that, they carried like a big 52-gallon barrel made of metal, and there was a fire inside the barrel which they carried. They carried with a long pole going through holes, and they stopped at the various apartments, and they shouted, "Kashering, kashering," so anyone who wanted to kasher the dishes had to come down and bring the stuff, and they put it in the boiling water, and it was sort of like done for you. That must have been some particular scene which I remember from Warsaw. We don't see anything like that in this country. I'm not so sure that's in, whether you even see it in Israel either. But people found it a convenient way of kashering things. And the rest of the time was just a nice, easy time. The children usually got some new clothes for Pesach. It was the end of the winter, which everybody looked forward to, because the winters in Poland were quite long and cold and hard. So Pesach indicated the end of winter and coming off with spring and summer, and something which was very welcome.
You mentioned that most of your friends, and you lived in a Jewish neighborhood.
Yeah.
Did you have any non-Jewish friends?
Not personal friends, because my friends were from the school. But my parents dealt with non-Jewish people. There were some people who came to do the laundry in our place, who were non-Jewish. We also had some people to do something which we were not allowed to, you can call them a Shabbos goy. People who knew that it was already prearranged from week to week, that they could do some things which were forbidden for us to do, like putting lights on or fire or something like that.
How would you prearrange it?
Pardon?
How would you prearrange it?
Prearrange it because that very same person came week after week, year after year, so it was all pretty well.
Could it be anybody?
No, the very same same lady came in and did a particular task that my mother arranged for her to do.
Would she get paid for it?
Oh yeah, that was a paid job, yeah.
How much would you pay for something like that?
No idea.
But
obviously it was worthwhile for them to do it. It was not a big deal for them to do it, and so we got the job done and they were happy to do it.
I'm going to stop here and pick up with the next tape. This is tape 2 with Michael Novice, tape 2 with Michael Novice. We were talking about your life before the war.
Yeah.
Before 1939, did you encounter in your town any feelings of anti-Semitism?
Oh yeah. Very much so, yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
First there were always writings on the wall, Jews go to Palestine. Then the stores on the street where we lived, there were some non-Jewish stores at the very front on the street, and it said, this is a Christian store, don't buy at Jewish stores. So that was very open anti-Semitism. And we had a bunch of hooligans who just, if you were, say, to go to a park or something like that, they just came and had sticks in the hand and beat people up.
Why?
Why? Because they did not like the Jews, that's an understatement, and they felt they could do it without any punishment, and so they just did it. Animosity.
Did it ever happen to you?
At one time, I remember being on a sort of like a little bridge and looking down, and one Christian fellow sort of came up and grabbed me by my pants and almost like threw me over. Of course, he was joking; he wouldn't have done that, but this kind of thing.
How did you know that it was because you were Jewish?
He could recognize us. I was there with a few other boys.
Would you wear a kippah? Did you wear a kippah or anything?
No, I did not wear a kippah. But it was a Jewish area.
Did he say anything to you?
No, he didn't say anything. He sort of just like wanted to tease me or frighten me. But other occasions where open violence occurred in Warsaw, and at the particular time, which was known, and people took care not to expose themselves, it was around about Easter time, because it was known that the priests in the churches, in their sermon, accused the Jews of being Christ killers, and they were so enticed and angry that if they could see a Jew in a sort of isolated place, it was they could actually kill him, knife him. And so people knew about that, and they didn't go out. They more or less like locked themselves in.
Did your father ever talk to you about that?
Yeah.
What did he say?
He said that we shouldn't go out, and he also knew instances where some people were knifed and killed or just clubbed with sticks.
Was your father ever assaulted for being Jewish?
I could not say, cannot remember whether he spoke from experience or he knew from what happened to other people.
When Kristallnacht happened, did you hear about that?
No. As you know, Kristallnacht happened in Germany, and whether it sort of transmitted itself to Poland, I would not know. And if it did, I was sort of perhaps too young to be concerned about it.
Did you hear anything in the papers of what's going on in Germany before '39?
Yeah.
What did you hear? What did you read?
We definitely heard about Hitler. The word Hitler was already, when I was very small, I already knew about him.
What did you know?
That he was against the Jews. To what extent, I would not know. And in fact, some Poles, to the extent of showing their anti-Semitism, they shouted out to Jews to say, "You wait until Hitler comes and he gets you." You know? And another thing which I could perhaps take the opportunity and say it, because this is the way I feel, and that is that in some ways the Poles were more anti-Semitic than the Germans. And I can end by saying that had the Poles not been so against the Jews, so anti-Semitic, perhaps the whole history of the Holocaust would have been quite different. Because then the Germans would have realized that what they tried to do wouldn't work. So if the roles, say, between Poland and, say, Holland or Denmark were reversed, if the Poles were like the people of Denmark, then perhaps Hitler would, or his helpers, the Nazis, would see that what we're trying to do is not going to work, they would have stopped doing it. But because they could see that they had support from the population, then it gave them the impetus to go ahead and do. Another thing I remember by way of anti-Semitism, when the war broke out the first month of the war, which was September 1939. Warsaw was suffered quite a lot. It was bombarded, and also they decided the Polish army to sort of put up a resistance against the German army around Warsaw, because this was sort of the prime town, whereas most other places fell very easily to the German army. They put up a stand around Warsaw. And so when it was, say, when we had to line up to buy a loaf of bread from perhaps a non-Jewish baker or some stalls, the Poles just didn't allow the Jews to stand there, and just gave them a hard time. And the same thing repeated itself later on, where when the Germans did come into Warsaw, and there was still some rationing, and people were standing in the line, these very same Poles pointed out to the German gendarmes who sort of supervised, the order of the line, who is Jewish and who is not. Well, who is Jewish, and that person was just taken out of line and removed.
Were you on these lines?
No.
How do you know this?
Because it was known from the way things were discussed at home.
When the war broke out and they bombarded the city, how did that affect your family?
One bomb fell, I would say, within about 20 feet from our apartment. As a result of that bomb, which knocked down a portion of the apartment, we had a split in our own wall, going right from the 4th floor all the way down, and that crack in the wall was never repaired, so we just had to live with it. And then there was the supply of water was somehow disrupted.
Were you at home when it happened?
Yeah. A terrible big bang, possibly the biggest I've ever heard. And
what happened after that?
After the bomb? Well, the part of the apartment where the bomb fell, direct hit, just went into rubble. And we had a crack in the wall, which, as I said, was never repaired. We just lived with it. And the water supply was discontinued, was not available, so we had to go to the river, which was quite a distance away from where we lived, with buckets, and carry water for drinking and cooking purposes.
Was everybody home when that happened?
Yeah.
What happened in the apartment when the bomb hit? What happened?
Well, people, if they were there, they got killed. But one thing I can say is that a siren sounded when the planes came. And it was always a question of knowing what to do. Would it go to the cellar of the building? There was always a cellar in these big buildings. Or run into some other places. Or sometimes you did the right thing, sometimes you did the wrong thing. So
what did you do?
we went to the cellar and waited until it was all clear and we came out again.
How old were you?
12, going to 13, yeah. That was the very first month of the war I'm talking to. Towards the end of September, Warsaw capitulated and the Germans came in.
When the Germans came in, do you remember that?
Yeah.
Did you see them coming in?
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, the first thing I remember is that they caught people, took them off the street for the purpose of getting the people to do some work for them. And so when we saw these people come, the trucks and the uniforms, everyone who could take cover just ran away, so that we weren't caught. Not everyone was successful, and also the Germans ran after the people. But things were not too bad at that point, because although they caught you, you sort of had to be an adult. Perhaps, since I was a small boy, even if they were to catch me, they perhaps wouldn't have taken me, because I was too small for the jobs they had in mind.
Were they armed?
Yeah, always armed. Always armed.
Were they in uniform?
Yeah.
What did it look like?
Well, the typical Germans, there were some that were wearing black uniforms, indicating one thing, and some were wearing the green uniforms, which is ordinary soldiers, or the Gestapo. And typically, in September the weather wasn't too bad yet, but as the time went on and the winter started, say in November or something like that, it was very common for them to come in and take these people off the street and make them clear the airports of snow. So, but whether they did this kind of work or other kind of work, it was not too bad, because the people, after doing the work, were released and they came back home. So this is to be contrasted with cases where someone was caught and never to be seen again.
Was anybody from your family ever caught?
My father was, and my brother.
And what happened to them?
They just disappeared for a day, and then they came back and they told what happened.
What did they say?
Well, a group of people, perhaps 15, 20, 30 people, all hold it in a truck, were taken and brought to the place of work. They were asked to do the work, and then were released.
What kind of work?
Mainly clearing up, cleaning, carrying, transporting.
Were they beat up or?
Not always. Some, yes.
Was your father?
My father was not beaten up, not at that time, no. Sometimes they were beaten up just for fun, just because they enjoyed beating people up, knowing and seeing that they had no choice but just to accept whatever was dished out for them.
When did things started to get worse?
Was. And as far as Warsaw is concerned, that's the one I can speak for, is that we lived right in the ghetto, but people from outside Warsaw, 10 miles from the center, they were evicted, and they were sort of pushed into the heart of the ghetto, and it was the responsibility of the people in charge of the ghetto, the Judenrat or something like that, you know, to find accommodations for people.
Now, before there was a ghetto, were there any restrictions on the people in town?
Yes, it sort of went in stages. First it was a ghetto, as known as perhaps as an open ghetto, where Jews were allowed to live in that ghetto and go out as well. So that was an open ghetto. Then it was a closed ghetto, insofar that the Jews were allowed to live in the designated area, but they themselves were not allowed to go to the Christian side. And then there was a really closed ghetto, as we had it, say, in 41 already. That's when I left, 94, where Christians were not allowed to go in, and it was barricaded, it was barbed wire all around.
So you were in the ghetto?
I was in the ghetto for 2 years. Well, perhaps
What was the
one and a
street?
half actually.
What was the street you lived on in the ghetto?
The name? The name is Zamenhof.
And what was the number? The number?
The number was number 18.
So you never moved. You were born there, and you grew up with your family there, and this place became the ghetto?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We lived in another street other than Zamenhof before that, so I got this just a little bit of a vague memory of this other place. Must have been perhaps like 5 years before the beginning of the war. So I must have been about 7 or 8 years old when they moved from one place to another place. The previous place was called Pavia Street.
And was that a part of the ghetto as well?
That was part of the ghetto. Perhaps like a 15-minute walk from one place to another place. And once I just mentioned the word Pavia, remember also that that particular street had a prison, and it was known as the Paviak prison, which the Poles used for ordinary thieves and other criminals. And when the Germans took it over, they used these premises for political prisoners or Jews or whatever. And so now, incidentally, also whilst mentioning the name Zamenhof, if you were to look up an encyclopedia, you would find that it was named after a doctor called Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, and he was known to be as the father of a new language called Esperanto. And so I remember when we lived, and we lived on number 18. Across the main street of where we lived was number 9, and there was a placard on the wall that says, "In this house lived Dr. Ludwig Zamenhof, inventor of the Esperanto language." So
you mentioned the Judenrat. Can you tell me how did that work?
Well, that was sort of perhaps typical of the way the Germans worked from the very beginning to the very end, and that is they allowed the Jews to do the dirty work for them. So they must have got hold of some people who could be regarded as the representative of the Jewish people, and they called them the Judenrat.
Do you remember the names of the heads of the Judenrat?
Not something, could be like Chernyakov or something like that. And so whenever they wanted to give certain orders, they did it through this Judenrat, the president, and perhaps like another 10 or 15 people who helped them, and they were known as the Judenrat. And towards the very end, like 2 years later, when the Nazis started deporting people from Warsaw, it was the job of this Judenrat to supply these people. And also the Judenrat was given the job of providing a so-called Jewish police. So you saw Jewish people with a sort of uniform which distinguished them from the ordinary people with caps, and they were known as the Jewish police, and it was their job to round up people and bring them to a special place where these carriages were waiting, wagons, for deportation.
Did you know any of the Jewish police people?
No. At first it was a very privilege for a person to be a Jewish policeman, because you could always sort of get a little bit of advantage of getting some bread or finding something. But towards the very end, I'm sure that the Jewish police didn't like doing the job they were asked to do. So there may have been a little bit of an advantage to them insofar that they were not the very first to go and being transported away, but in the end they too went.
Can you tell me about your life in the ghetto? What was your daily routine in the ghetto?
Well, that was somehow not all that easy because there was no more school. In fact, it was one of the photographs I may have shown you was with my sister and my mother. This was the last photograph taken from our vacation. And after the vacation in September, as was the case with all schools and in all previous years, this is when school started. But because of the war, the school never opened. So we never went to school. So my parents tried to arrange for some private tuition with a teacher from the school. And so we did it for about a couple of months. And in fact, there's another little story about that. And I remember at one time, must have been perhaps between 5 or 10 boys attending that class given by the teacher. And someone must have reported this event to the Gestapo. And whilst we were having a class, there was a knock at the door, and the Gestapo came in, and they could see what was going on, namely that it was a class, and they took the teacher away, and he was never seen again. And so that was the end of the attempt to get some education. It wasn't so much perhaps the education, but the parents had to keep the children occupied with something.
What was the name of the teacher?
I cannot remember. But this was the teacher which we knew from the school, from when we did go to the school.
Were there any other arrangements of keeping up cultural events or anything like that, or religious services?
I'm sure that there were, but I did not participate too much in it.
What about food? How did you get food?
Food was always a problem. In fact, I can say that almost from the very beginning, which is like September 1939, for the next 5 years, I think I was continually hungry. And at first, the food was short. There was a shortage of food, but so the people could get it because there was still contact with the general Polish population. But you have to have money to buy. So what really boiled down in the end that people had to sell whatever they possessed in order to get the money in order to buy something. But all that came to an end within a year or two.
How much was the loaf of bread at that point?
I really could not tell. No. It would have to be expressed in terms of zlotys, but even if I were to tell you that it had to be related to how much you could earn.
How easy or hard was it to get a loaf of bread?
I remember one thing about this, and that is that when my mother went out to buy a loaf of bread, on the way back home with that loaf of bread, she was attacked by hungry people, and she never brought it. The people just grabbed it, took it out from her possession, and they just ate it as they were grabbing it. A few people did the same thing, because they were much worse for us than we were, because we could still afford to buy the bread. And when my mother did bring the bread, not on this particular day, before or after, sort of rationed it out, so everybody got a tiny amount. And then, in addition to the bread, we made some sort of like potato soup, And that went on for, as far as I'm concerned, that went on until the spring of 1941.
Now, what kind of arrangement was it in terms of the household? Was there just your family, or were there any other people?
We had one family that was added, which we didn't even know, and this was arranged by the Judenrat, which I said. And these people came from another town, which was fairly large, but it was taken over and the people were pushed out, and that was from Lodz. There was such a thing as a Lodz ghetto, similar to the Warsaw ghetto, but some people were driven out from the Lodz ghetto towards the Warsaw ghetto, and everyone had to open up the houses and accept people. But this was towards the end of my stay at home. And because things were sort of so really bad, that my parents, without asking me, decided to take me out of the ghetto. So they arranged by bribing a Polish policeman, and also we had one relative who worked with my father as a helper, and his parents lived in the province, not far from where my own parents were born. And he must have been in his 20s.
We're going to stop here and pick up with the next tape. This is tape 3 with Michael Novice. Tape 3 with Michael Novice. You were telling me about spring of 1941.
All right. Spring of 41, I remember that the festival of Pesach in 1941 was already very bad, and nothing to be compared with the Pesach or Passover festival we had before the war. Perhaps even 1940, which was like 6 months after the beginning of the war. It was already not right, but it was passable, you know. But 1941 was really very bad.
What does it mean, very bad?
Shortage of food, number one. The ghetto was already created. People were unsafe to walk on the street. As I said, they were just beaten up by the Germans and taken away. And my health was somehow beginning to show a certain weakness. I had frostbite from the winter, and they sort of turned into a wound which didn't heal. And they said that it didn't heal because the diet didn't include any fat. So this brings me to another little story which I remember, and that is that the only fat that could be obtained was non-kosher fat, whereas to the very end we kept kosher. In fact, at the time when Warsaw was besieged, September 39, perhaps even going into October, there was a shortage of food which included meat, but one type of meat was available, and that is that horses, which were used in cavalry, by the soldiers. Not only the soldiers, but the horses themselves were killed by the Germans in the first month of the war. So some people used horse meat as meat for food. But in our household, because of the kashrut, my mother did not allow that, and so we went without that. And similarly with the fat, there's no butter or margarine or anything like that. So even we could find some bread and potatoes. The lack of fat somehow caused me to have these blisters um, on my foot. And so my mother arranged to have some of this non-kosher fat, but she kept it in a special place high up on a cupboard, which only to be used by me, sort of to be spread on a piece of bread when the bread was available. So my parents arranged for me to be taken out of the ghetto.
How old were you?
41? No, 14 years.
So when you were 13, you were in the ghetto?
Yeah,
Did you get to have a bar mitzvah?
yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
It was a simple thing, considering the situation and circumstances.
What was it like?
I think called after the Torah and having some tefillin.
Where did you have the Torah?
There were Torahs in the ghetto. Yeah.
Was it at somebody's house?
Yeah.
Who was there?
Who was there? Just the neighbors and the family.
And how did you celebrate it?
Just with whatever, if there was any hard drink, I'm not too sure whether there was. Possibly people still had from old stock. You know. But we were so preoccupied with other things that these things didn't seem to matter much. Another similar thing in same vein, I remember people got married. You would think that the last thing people would do would be to get married, but some people were sort of, engaged from before, and they could see what was going on, so they got married. So if they were to be deported or be killed, the argument was they would be killed together, the new married couple.
Were you in any wedding? Were you invited to any?
Yes, I saw one wedding.
What was it like?
Very simple, but very moving.
Was there a rabbi?
Yeah. Rabbi. There are lots of rabbis involved, so there was no difficulty. In fact, I was told only briefly, so I'm not so sure whether this is correct or not, that my own brother David, who was born 1920, must have been about 21, that he got married. So
Was he there with you?
No, I was already gone. Yeah.
Could you correspond from the ghetto?
No telephone, no nothing.
What about letters? No.
No. So perhaps let me tell you that my escape from Warsaw Ghetto, at that time it was already fully closed, right? No Jewish people could leave the ghetto to go outside. But so my parents found a way by bribing a Polish policeman. So for money, he made arrangements. And arrangements were that on the streets of Warsaw, the main transportation consisted of the tramways. They used to call it like a trolley bus, but it got electricity from high up wires, and it was on rails, which meant that the vehicles were actually confined to certain areas. You just couldn't go like a bus go wherever. Now, one section of this tram line, we called it, had to pass through a Jewish ghetto for it to turn round. So people made use of that fact, that as it came from the non-Jewish side and turned around in the Jewish side and back in the non-Jewish side, and the whole operation took like a couple minutes. The way I was whisked out from the ghetto is that this policeman was bribed, and when the carriage was in the ghetto, I jumped in and I laid down on the floor. And so when it went through the checkpoint, they looked in and they could see that only the policeman was there, guarding that it was 100% empty. And as soon as it went back into the outside the ghetto, people started boarding it. So I had to sort of quickly get up and pretend that I was one of the passengers.
Did you have an armband or a star?
No, I discarded it. Yeah. But as I mentioned, I was in the company of another person who was over 20. So both of us did whatever we did together. And it was extremely dangerous. But my parents must have calculated that the chances were worse, chances of survival were smaller, and they were worse by remaining in ghetto than by outside. So we just took the chance. And so once we were on the outside ghetto, there was always the difficulty and the danger of being detected. Of course, it was much more difficult for men than for women. And as I already mentioned earlier too, the fright was, the danger came from being recognized by the Poles and not by the Germans. To the Germans, we sort of all looked the same. They could not really, unless they were obviously Jewish with a beard or so, but I was not, and neither was my distant cousin with them. And so our object was, once we were on the outside of the ghetto, to go find public transportation and go to the province, which was about this Ostrovets, which was about 200 or 300 miles south of Warsaw. And when we thought that to go by train was dangerous, because all trains were sort of controlled, by the gendarmes, Gestapo and police, checking people's papers, and we did not have any papers. So we decided to take a steamboat that went down on the big river Vistula. So we were there a few days, I believe. It sort of was a slow coach thing, and it was mainly used by peasants who came from the province to Warsaw, bringing provisions, whether it was potatoes or flour or bread. They sold it and then they went back, probably with items which were only obtained in Warsaw. So it was quite a commercial type of venture.
Did you have to pay for it?
We paid for it. Yeah, we had to go and buy a ticket and enter that steamboat.
How did you get the money for it?
We had money. Don't know how my parents got it.
Now, your cousin, what was his name?
Nathan Kloss.
Was it your mother's side of the family?
No, I think it was my father's side. And
so you got on that steamboat?
A steamboat, and it took a few days or nights. And one particular occasion I remember is when the boat was really boarded by the German police. And their object was to see whether any ammunition or some other contraband things were on board. So most people were, whatever parcel they had, they were asked to sort of like open up. And when it came to us, we also opened up, but we didn't have much, just perhaps a shirt or clothes, I don't know, can't remember what we sort of had with us. Not a typical suitcase or anything like that, much smaller than that. But our, what we were afraid of was that we would be detected as non-Jew, as Jews, because we pretended to be peasants. And in particular, we're afraid of the Poles, who could have possibly recognized us as not being a typical Pole, by the way they would behave, by the way we were dressed, and also the tendency was then for them to know each other and to be in groups. We were just isolated.
What did you wear?
We wear whatever clothes we could have still. Nothing very elaborate.
So did they come up to you?
They came up and they opened, we did whatever they were asked, and I wouldn't be here if they had any suspicion that we were Jews.
Did they ask you anything?
No, they would possibly ask me what I carry and where I'm going, something like that. It was really one of the first big frightful moments.
What was going through your head when they came up to you?
That within a few minutes I could be dead. But that was sort of part of the game, you know, you sort of had to accept it as being fact.
Were they armed?
Yeah, always armed.
Were they pointing their...
No, but they had the guns. And so we passed that checkpoint. The German came on board. We didn't go out of the vessel. So after the inspection, we continued, and then we disembarked.
Where?
In a place on the Vistula, which was not far from the town of Ostrovets. But it was a question of walking. For some reason it was decided that we walk. So we walked perhaps a day, a whole day. And I relied on my cousin who came from that part of Poland to know which way to go and how. So first of all went to his parents.
What are their names?
Klaus.
And the first names?
He was Nathan, or Nute, because in the Jewish or Hebrew name was Nute, but it was Nathan.
And his parents' name?
I cannot remember.
So you came over their place?
Went up to their place, but his destination was to stay with his parents, and my destination was to use this as just a stopping off point and then continue to my aunt, relatives of my father who lived in Ostrovets. So I had to make my way by myself from the place where we alighted and to Ostrovets. And I think we went by sort of like a horse and buggy type thing. Distance may have been like 10 or 15 miles, but it took a whole day. And then when I joined my cousin and his mother, I sort of became part of the family.
How long did you stay there?
From 41 until 42. And then the place was liquidated, the whole town of Jews, in 1942. But I stayed working in that factory.
Who liquidated it?
The Germans.
When did they come in? Do you remember?
Before actually it was liquidated, let me tell you sort of another thing which happened in the places like that. The Germans engaged Ukrainian people and people from Lithuania who were sort of, their whole purpose was just to kill people. So they came usually at night, and whoever they found, they just took outside and shot them on the spot, like a terror group.
Did you see them do that?
Yes, yeah. And we had to hide in a cellar of where my aunt lived, I and my cousins.
What is your aunt's name
Ruth.
and her last name?
The same as our name, because it was the husband's, my uncle, who was already deceased at that time, was my father's brother. So before the ghetto was liquidated, and by that I mean you were given orders, or people knocking at the door to leave everything and go and collect, assemble in a marketplace. That was the usual thing. Before that, there was sort of a terror campaign where these Ukrainians, and they did it out of enjoyment, and all Lithuanians, they wear the typical uniforms. They just came in, and whoever they could get hold of, they just killed them on the spot. So it was a question of hiding and letting the time pass by. And
Was it a certain time of the day that they did that?
usually at night.
And were people aware?
Yes, yeah, the word spread around, right, so we knew.
Was there a curfew?
Yeah, yeah.
What time was there a curfew?
Usually when it got dark, perhaps about an hour or so before that complete darkness.
Were there other restrictions?
Well, it was a ghetto. The restriction was that you couldn't leave the ghetto.
What happened if you left?
If you were caught, you were definitely killed. If not killed, they could perhaps use you for some work in a camp.
Did you know anybody that wanted to escape, that tried to escape?
No.
What about food? How did you manage to get food?
Typically it was contacts with Christian people from before and selling whatever possessions you had. So the richer you were, the more you had. The poorer you were, it was very bad.
How many people were living with you? You said you were with your aunt.
Yeah.
Was there any other families there?
Yes. I think there were about 5 children. And my 2 cousins, with whom I later on left sort of this place when the whole place was liquidated. We started working in that factory. But then there was the mother and a daughter, and I think 1 or 2 other smaller children. And this was typical that the Germans or their helpers, like the Ukrainian, Lithuanians, they sort of sorted out people who were of some use and people who were like garbage, useless people. And so mothers with children were the first ones to go. So at one point in time in that place, Ostrovets, I think which occurred in all other towns, and that is you were informed by people knocking on the door, by some other means, that you had to leave everything, take whatever you want to take and assemble in the marketplace.
Which was where? Where was the marketplace?
Pardon?
Where was the marketplace?
Usually in the center, perhaps like 10-minute walk from where we lived. And this was the marketplace where typically before the war, long before the war, on Mondays and Thursdays, the peasants used to come with the horse and wagons, and they used to bring produce from the farms, butter, cheese, potatoes, goodness, or perhaps chicken, and in turn the merchants from the town brought their produce, whether it was clothes or shoes, and there was sort of a barter or an exchange, and that repeated itself for years and years before the war. They know why it was always on the Mondays and the Thursdays, because it so happens these are also the days where we read the Torah in the synagogue on a Monday and Thursdays. So whether it was a Jewish thing or they somehow knew, it was convenient. So
people were assembled.
they were assembled there,
and what
because
happened?
this was the only big place, empty place in town, marketplace.
Do you remember the date when that happened?
No.
So what happened then?
What happened then was that I never saw the family again. We parted. We who could work, in fact, in my particular case, in the case of my cousin, we, realizing what was going on, we started working for that big factory, which was a smelting factory in town, before, when we still lived with the family. What factory?
Okay.
It was perhaps one of the biggest factories in the town of Ostrovets, and must have existed there for many years, perhaps 50, 100 years. And most of the population, non-Jewish population, used to work in that place.
And you and your cousin were working there?
We volunteered to work there whilst we were still living with the family, because it gave us sort of like a reason for existence. And so when the place was dissolved and everybody was asked to go to the marketplace, we also went to the marketplace, but we went in sort of like a different part of the marketplace, because we could tell them that we are working in that company there.
And who was assembling the people?
The German.
Were there German soldiers?
With the help, huh?
Were there German soldiers
yeah,
there?
Yeah. But always had the help from the Ukrainian and the Lithuanian people.
So after everybody went on the trucks?
Yeah.
Was the trucks?
Yeah.
What happened then?
There were, the most of the population was just carted away, never to be seen again, taken to the extermination points. Don't know where people from Ostrovets went, possibly to a place like Treblinka or Majdanek.
What year was this?
That was 42.
And you stayed in the camp and you stayed to work?
I stayed at work, right, from 42 to 44, 2 years. And that was the passport our existence, by proving ourselves to be useful for the war machinery. The place produced iron from the ore, you know, and in turn the iron was turned into wheels to be used on trains. It was an item very much needed by the Germans.
How many hours a day did you work?
We worked something like 8 hours, at least 8 hours. And very frequently when we finished work and we went back home, there was a need to do some more work, so they called you back. So very frequently, if not very frequently, people had to put in 2 shifts of work. By shift I meant both we, Jewish people, and the non-Jewish people who worked in that big factory. I worked on 3 shifts, 8 hours a shift. So the 24-hour day was divided into 3 shifts. And it was sort of like rotation. First you worked the first shift, and the afternoon shift, and the night shift.
And you said you were going back home. Where was back home?
It was barracks. Once we were asked to leave the homes and assemble into this marketplace, we never came back home. That was never to be seen. It was razed, demolished, or perhaps occupied by the Poles.
I'm going to stop here and pick up with the next tape.